We all know the phrase, a peak experience, or a mountaintop experience. In the last few decades, it's used a lot for real high points in your life, moments of achievement, moments of exhilaration, moments of family gatherings. But the origin of the phrase goes back far, far before that. It goes back to the readings we've heard today. Our first reading was about Moses going to the mountain and going into the presence of the Lord and dwelling there. And as the story continues in Exodus, it's said that when he would come down, Moses' face would glow with such a light that it frightened people, so that he began to wear a veil just so that he wouldn't intimidate the people around him. And then we have the gospel reading. Here we have Jesus taking 3 of his disciples up a mountain where he's transfigured, a figure filled with light. And beside him, Moses and Elijah talking. The thing that we have to realize is that as unique as that vision may have seemed, that was actually the reality. That was who Jesus was. What he was showing his disciples was a glimpse through the window to things as they really are. A reality that they would not see again until after he was raised. If they had really understood what they were seeing, that everything that would follow in the weeks and months to come would not have surprised them, because they had seen the reality. A mountaintop experience. The thing is that it's not just in biblical times that these things happen. One of Martin Luther King's most famous speeches was the last one he gave, which had become to be called the "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. The situation was that he had gone to Memphis to help the sanitation workers, and the marches hadn't gone particularly well. There had been a lot of turmoil, violence had broken out, and not only that, there were some terrible threats. There were always threats, and all too often the threats of violence turned out to be true. But in this case, the threats seemed particularly dire. So knowing that he needed to help his group, he had everyone come together that evening into the church, where he gave a rousing sermon about reminding them what they were doing, what they were after, and what they could accomplish. But right at the end of the sermon, he stopped, and his tone changed, and he became very reflective. He began to remember how he had had an assassination attempt earlier in his life. He had come out of a speech, and a woman had come up to him and said, "Are you Dr. Martin Luther King?" And he said, "Yes." And the next thing he remembers, he woke up in the emergency room. She had plunged a knife in his chest. The doctor told him afterwards that the knife had come within millimeters of his aorta. And the doctor said, "If you had sneezed, you would have died." They were able to patch him together. And as he recovered, he talked about receiving letters from the president and from world leaders, from many other significant people. But he said there was one letter that touched him in particular. And I'll let him tell you what he said, how he described it. But there was another letter that came from a little girl, a young girl, who was a student at the White Plains High School. And I looked at that letter, and I'll never forget it. It said simply, "Dear Dr. King, I am a 9th grade student at the White Plains High School." She said, "While it should not matter, I would like to mention that I am a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and your suffering, and I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. I'm simply writing you to say that I'm happy that you didn't sneeze." He then goes on to reflect about the fact that he is very happy that he didn't sneeze too. And he reviews his life since then and all the things that had managed to be done. He reviewed one march after another. He reviewed the sit-ins, the peace marches, the times when people came together who didn't believe that they could come together. People found courage to resist powers that they didn't think that they could resist. Barriers that people thought were unbreakable had broken down. But then he brought himself to that very moment in Memphis, and he said, and I think for those of you who remember this speech will remember the tone in which he said this, the emotion in his voice. And then I got into Memphis, he said. And some began to say the threats, or talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from one of our sick white brothers? Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it doesn't matter about me now. Because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like everybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go to the mountain. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He gave that speech on April 8th, 1968. The next day, on April 4th, he was shot and killed. But isn't it remarkable that with some sort of premonition of what was to come, he could tell that congregation that he was at peace because he had been to the mountain. He had seen the reality. And so whatever came, he was prepared. So it is worthwhile to go to the mountain. It is worthwhile. And reading today's gospel and thinking about Dr. King, I found myself wondering, have I ever been to the mountain? Have I ever had an experience like that? And the fact was, I could remember that in many ways I had. And I'd like to tell you about it. In order to do that, I have to take you back to when I was 20 years old. At that point, I spent the summer working as a captain steward on a merchant marine ship. We made 2 crossings of the Atlantic. The second one we stopped in Germany, and our final port of call was in Cork, Ireland. I've shared with you before that during this time of my life I had a lot of doubts about religion. As a matter of fact, I considered myself agnostic. And yet despite that, as soon as we docked into Cork, I knew exactly where I wanted to go. I had my bag packed. We no sooner had the boat against the dock than I was down the gangplank and out the door. I rented a car, and by that evening I had driven that car to a little tiny town on the far western edge of Ireland that I had marked on my map. The town turned out to be a single pub and a little store right on the edge of some cliffs, barren cliffs. And I walked into the store and I said, "Where do I go to find a motel?" They just laughed. They said, "There's no motel here." And I said, "Well, where do people go who come here?" And they said, "Well, no one really comes here." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Well, okay. Some people do come to see our islands out off the coast. And when they do, we usually send them to Kathleen. She'll put them up and give them breakfast for the night for £5. So I got directions to Kathleen's house, and sure enough, she had a room free. So sitting with her that night, I told her that I too was here to see the islands off the coast. And she said, "Oh, you're here to see our skellings." And I said, "Yes, when does the tour leave?" He said, "Oh, we have no tour." He said, "But there is a fisherman who will take you out, that sometimes goes out if the weather isn't too bad." He said, "Tomorrow's Saturday. If there's any day he'll do it, it'll be tomorrow. Let me give him a call." So she came back and she said, "Yes, he's going out tomorrow if the weather isn't too bad. Be on the dock at sunrise. At sunrise I was there. And there were a few other ones there too. And you know the way strangers do, we sort of stood kind of apart, but I heard a couple over in one corner, and they were speaking German. There was another couple, white-haired couple. They were speaking a language I didn't recognize, but I found out later was Belgian. There were a few Italians there, some other Irish and English. I was the only American. 9 of us all together. Plus, in addition, there was the fisherman, and beside him his son, who was probably about 10 years old. And they were peering out into the ocean. Time went by, and finally one of the German women went up to him and said, so are we going or not? He says, well, I don't know. I don't know. It's pretty rough out there, and it's going to get worse. And she said, well, what about those boats? And she pointed out to some boats out in the harbor. She said, what about them? He said, oh, they're fishing boats. She said, they're okay. They don't have to land out there. And then he pointed way in the distance. And just on the horizon, I saw what looked like a little finger of land just peeking up, and beside it another, more like a thumb. And I said, is that where we're going? And he said, yes. And he said, it's bad enough trying to land out there when it's calm, but when it's rough, I want to get my son back alive. A few more minutes went by, and then he said, all right, we're going to go. 20 pounds and you can come. But I'll tell you, you may regret it.